so therefore the presentations have to be short, they have to be tight, we never ever have enough time, but we only ask people for, you know, a block of time. Now Brother Lumumba is going to be next, and then we're gonna sort of change the flow a bit because our author, Dr. Newkirk, is here, and we had some miscommunication about the books and a whole bunch of other stuff, but she has another commitment. Typically what we do is, you know, we have a short presentation, and the book signing is typically at the end of the meeting, not in the middle of it, but because we had this sort of miscommunication, we'll be creative and so forth. But I know Lumumba, we've been trying to get him here, praise God, for like 40 years. And he's kind enough to come today. His daughter's birthday is today, and I promised him we would try to get him out of here by 12:30 and no later than that. So, and please, I'm not trying to, but I mean, we are glad to have you here because of the work that you do. So that will complete this block, and then we can then transition and then have Dr. Newkirk make her short presentation. Then she can then move on to her other commitment, and then we'll go back. In fact, when we do that, we'll also bring Imam Taliban to do his tribute to Malcolm. The Black History block will be out, and then we'll move forward. So I'm just having to do some adjustments here with your permission. So now we turn to Brother Lumumba Bendel. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody.
Lumumba, could you come?
I mean, I think I can see everybody from here. That's okay?
You're okay.
I'm okay. That's what I thought. Okay, great. So I want to just talk really briefly about, I was asked to talk a little bit about the policing work that we're doing through the Communities United for Police Reform, a very comprehensive coalition of organizations around New York City to impact discriminatory policing in New York City. Glad to have one of our allied organizations, Keep Wise and Safe, here. And so I want to do this by just speaking anecdotally about the most recent case that I'm sure everyone is familiar with, the case of Kai Gurley and the recent conviction of Peter Liang. I sat in the trial from jury selection to the actual conviction. And there are a number of things that this particular experience raised that I want to just highlight and then just talk about some of the specific policy things that CPR is working on. For those who are not familiar with the case, Kai Gurley is was a 28-year-old man who was in pink houses with a friend, decided to take the stairs to go down. Peter Liang and his partner, Officer Sean Landau, say that they were assigned to do vertical patrols in the pink houses. I'm going to talk about what vertical patrols actually are. But heard a sound in the stairwell that was dark. Peter Liang had his gun out already, heard the sound, pointed it down towards the dark stairwell, pulled the trigger, and Kai Gurley was killed. Peter Liang, Chinese-American officer, rookie, had done, I think, at most a year on the job, and it raised a lot of things. But one of the things that this particular case highlighted, and the way that the defense, Peter Liang's defense team presented it, was something that was not unheard of in this idea of police murders. It was the criminalization of public housing. It was the criminalization of East New York. And it was the criminalization of the pink houses specifically. In the trial, the cops had talked about their doing vertical patrols because a week before there was a shooting in that particular building. They were asked, well, why did you have your weapon drawn? And he said that they were trained to have their weapons out whenever they do vertical patrols. Now, vertical patrols are patrols that cops are supposed to do when they go into a building. They're supposed to make sure the hallways and stairwells are clear. So they go to the top floor and they just walk down the stairs, right? Well, in public housing, they do it because the NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, has an agreement with the New York Police Department where the police department enforces rules, not laws, rules of NYCHA. And what happens when you have a law enforcement agency enforcing rules, you end up having this blurred idea of what is a crime versus a violation of a rule. And so the vertical patrols is something that our organization, LDF, actually filed a lawsuit against NYCHA, and we did a settlement. Unfortunately, it does not end vertical patrols, but it did result in some shifting and changing of the patrol guide. So they say that they're trained to actually have their weapons drawn when they're doing vertical patrols, right? When asked why do they do this, in one of the manuals, they're told to be alert and aware of possible ambush. Now I raise this because we talk often in our circles about the war that's waged on us by NYPD, by law enforcement, and I want us to be very clear that that's not an ambiguous term that's being used, because law enforcement are actually trained to prepare themselves in a warlike manner. So not only are they militarized in terms of their framing, they're militarized in terms of their weaponry as well.
Right.
Right? And so you have law enforcement agents that are coming in our communities and that are patrolling public housing, and we know that 95% of public housing looks like this room. Right? You are not going to be impacting middle income or upper wealthy white people in public housing. You will not be patrolling their communities with your weapons drawn. So we understand that that was a big piece that had come out of this. Two things: the militarized framing and preparation of NYPD, the criminalization, but then also the idea that this is the first time in 10 years that a police officer had been convicted for the killing of an unarmed civilian. Right? The first time, the one before that was for the killing of Osman Zango. Right? And we know that that resulted not in any jail time, but in probation. Right. And so people are saying now that this particular case is one where it was sort of a low-hanging fruit, in that you had an officer of color, an Asian officer who they figured would be easy to convict and would be able to sort of say, well, here, we'll give you one.
Right.
And so it's important for us to be clear about a few things.
That's right.
Number one, Peter Yang is deserving of this conviction. Make no mistake about that. Right? He may very well be a low-hanging fruit. He very may well be. The idea that we are approaching this not as individual case by case, but we're talking about reforming and dismantling, in many cases, the police department as we know it. And that means that any cop who takes the life of our community members has to be held accountable. We would have been out there with the same fervor, the same energy, the same kind of strategy had it been a black cop. The same fervor, same energy had it been a Latino cop. And we have to be very clear about that. It's the institution that we are attacking. The individual, whatever, is a reflection of that. And so there's a lot that is coming out of that. Also, the reason that this case actually made it to trial was not because of the kind-hearted nature of the DA, as much as we all may like Kenny Thompson. But we are very clear it's because people all over this country were raising hell. People all over this country are raising hell is why he felt pressured to bring this case to trial.
Yes.
Right? So I want us to be clear that the idea that this is something that sits with the individual prosecutor's office is a problem. We have been since the early 90s calling for an independent prosecutor in police killings cases. Kenny Thompson has been opposed to it.
Right.
His position is that I want to do my job. My job is to indict and convict people who break the law. And let's be very clear, as people are praising Kenny Thompson, he did his job. Right. He did nothing beyond his job.
Right.
Right? And so the idea that the bar is set so low that someone only do their job in a capacity in an area that has not been done speaks volumes. Right?
Yes,
and so we are still calling for a special and independent prosecutor in police murder cases. I want to make this a distinction. Not in police murder cases of unarmed civilians, police murder cases in all cases. Because what they consider armed and unarmed may change. Right. We know Muhammad Ba was killed. They said he was armed, and they said he had a pair of scissors. They consider that to be armed. And so we are still calling for a special and independent prosecutor for all of these cases. We're also calling for alternatives to policing. This idea that the police are required in order to keep our communities safe is a huge fallacy that we've all bought into. If that were true, I live right around the corner from the 79th precinct. My block should be the safest block in New York City, theoretically. Theoretically, we know 2 years ago someone was shot right in front of the 88th precinct. So the idea that the existence of police making our community safe is a huge fallacy that our communities have bought into it, because we really have not had some serious dialogue around what safety looks like, what security looks like, why we actually need the police. One anecdotal piece also, we know in Brownsville, the brilliance of an organization out there called Man Up Inc. were able to establish within a full calendar year and a week no shootings in a 15-block radius. In Brownsville, I want y'all to know, if y'all are not from New York and don't know Brownsville, Brownsville has one of the highest rates of gun violence, of all kinds of things. It's where people don't go, right? But they were able to establish that not through police patrols, but through their own engagement with community.
That's right.
They patrol themselves, high schools, middle schools. They did all of this conflict resolution stuff. So we recognize that there are ways that we can create safety in our community without law enforcement. We have the responsibility and we have the ability. Understood? And then also, this is all part of a larger police reform initiative that CPR has been pushing. We currently have an initiative now. We're trying to get 2 remaining pieces of legislation passed through City Council called the Right to Know Act. We'll be sending more information to PARD, and hopefully you all will have some assignments to contact, if you are New York City residents, your City Council representatives, to make sure that it gets pushed through. And we want to make sure that this whole idea that stop and frisk has ended since your beloved mayor has been in office,
Right.
is dismantled, and understand that our approach is not for an inclusion of more police,
That's
on
right.
the police of color on the force. That's not it. We're talking about fundamentally creating safe and healthy communities that are not reliant on law enforcement, right? And what that looks like requires us to use our genius, our creativity, all of the things that we have at our disposal, because that in itself will be one of the only ways that we prevent police misconduct, police murders, and all kinds of things like that. And so we are pushing back against this idea of what they're calling community policing, where they are having police representatives come into our communities and you know, do all of these kinds of things. And we are not embracing this idea of Joe the Friendly Cop doing barbecues on Nostrand Avenue. That means nothing. Unless we have systems of accountability that are strictly enforced, that are community controlled, all of that other stuff is smoke and mirrors, right? And so we will be back with more direction, and hopefully we'll be able to get a more inclusive body of our communities on board.
All right, thank you much. We're just going to take one because I really do want to get to our author, but go right ahead.
It's short. That's just something I want to throw out there. I just want to know when it became a crime to speak ill of the police department. Because now, anytime somebody says something about the police, you anti-police, and all of this whole hoopla. So I don't know if anybody know the answer to that, but
Well, it's not a crime.
I just didn't know it was a thing.
Right, go ahead.
Well, that's just rhetoric. That's just rhetoric. Look, I've been in law enforcement 20